Hey everyone, welcome to Winnie's Travels and to the second part of my Fixing the Roof series, or I guess you could call it a situation. Today I'll be showing you how I went about replacing the RV roof vents by removing the ceiling insulation near the rough openings and then creating wood frames to line the rough openings and give me something sturdy to drill into. What I'm going to be doing today is taking out the rigid foam insulation that is near the vents in the ceiling. We can see that when I remove the foam board insulation, I'm first going to need to remove the bottom layer of wood and then the full 1.5 to 2 inches of insulation. And then there's a final layer of felt, essentially, that was kind of how the insulation cured to the metal ceiling. There's actually no easy way to remove rigid foam insulation besides using a razor, a saw, a circular saw, which I don't have one that's battery powered, so I'm gonna have to use a razor or some handheld tool. You can also use acetone or nail polish remover to get at the, once you remove the insulation, there's usually a thin layer and you can use acetone to get the rest of the residue off, but I don't want to do that because it's really bad for your body and I would have to use so much of it. My reasoning for removing the old insulation near the rough openings was that a lot of the insulation is water damaged and kind of destroyed, so I do plan on replacing all of it. So I figured that it didn't really make sense to drill the new roof vents into the old insulation when I then planned on removing it. When I tried to drill into the aluminum roof after I had removed the insulation, however, I frustratingly realized that the aluminum roof was now too thin, the material was too thin, and it had no backing. So after I tried to hastily mend that situation with some duct tape, I realized that I would need to find another solution. My first thought was that if I could somehow manage to waterproof the RV with a big tarp, then I wouldn't have to worry about the weather and I could actually install the insulation first and then go about replacing the roof vents. So I bought this big blue tarp for $80 from ULINE, but it was too thin and the wind and the weather tore it apart and it didn't even stay on, which was a huge bummer because it was pretty much a waste of my money. If I had known how to professionally install a tarp, that might have helped, but either way, I definitely would have needed a thicker one and therefore it would have been a lot more expensive. The next thing I tried was to cut up a thicker tarp that I found in my garage into smaller pieces and use duct tape to cover each individual rough opening by itself. And that didn't work either because the wind was no longer a problem, but the rain pooled up in the center and caved those in. So what it came down to was that I had to stick with my original plan of replacing the roof vents first and then replacing the insulation later. But that meant I had to come up with some sort of backing so that the roof wouldn't buckle under the weight of my drill. I decided to use some of the OSB plywood that I had purchased off of Craigslist to create these wood frames that I could glue to my ceiling to create that added thickness that I needed. That ended up working out really well, and I'll show you in my next video when I install the new roof vents. Now, of course, when I replace the new insulation, I will have to cut the foam board insulation to sort of accommodate that added thickness of that layer of wood, but cutting foam board insulation is really easy, so hopefully that won't be a problem, but we'll have to see. First, I measured around the roof vent, making sure that the wood frame was wider than the vent by about an inch or so. Then I copied those measurements 3 more times, since 4 of the roof vents are exactly the same. And I took measurements of the other 2 roof vents separately. There are 6 vents total. Next, I clamped the OSB board to my workshop table and used my dad's old jigsaw to cut the board down until the pieces were small enough for the table saw. Once I had all the pieces cut, I used construction paper to trace the curved corners of the vent openings. This way I was able to use my measuring tape and speed square to get the edge measurements and the construction paper cut out to copy the curve of the corners onto the wood. I knew I would use the jigsaw to cut the shape out, but first I had to use a hole saw to cut a piece out, since the jigsaw can't pierce the wood directly. It reminded me of what you do with scissors when you have to cut a hole out of paper. Once I had the first frame, I was able to sort of copy and paste the others of the same dimension. I used a construction adhesive to glue the frames to the ceiling, which had this horrible plastic tip that needed to be cut off before you could load it into the caulking gun, but it was easier said than done. The adhesive doesn't cure right away, so I used all the clamps that I had to clamp it to the ceiling, and then I waited the 30-minute cure time and then moved on to the next one. I then waited the full 24-hour cure time before installing the new vents. I was able to use my dad's jigsaw, but they sell for around $25 to $100 depending on the amperage and whether they're corded or cordless. I bought my 10-inch table saw on Craigslist for $95, but they usually run for around $50 to $250 depending on the size of the blade and whether they have a built-in stand. It was definitely a bummer that I ended up wasting so much money on a tarp that didn't solve any of my problems, but I got a great deal on Craigslist for the OSB. I got enough for my floor, walls, and most of my furniture, pretty much 75% of the wood that I will need, which is really awesome. That's all for now, folks. Stay tuned for the final part of my Fixing the Roof series, where I'll show you how I installed the new roof vents and also how I made sure that my old and leaky roof is now leak-proof. Thanks for watching. Please feel free to like this video and subscribe to my channel if you want to stay updated on Winnie's travels.